So when, at the age of 16, you became acquainted with Darwin, was it because you were taught about Darwin, or you began reading The Origin of Species?
No, it's because I was taught.
And were you taught by people who, as it were aware, or seemed to be aware of the fact that it would have theological consequences?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that wasn't the terms in which they put it, anyway.
How soon in the lessons did you begin to see that it did have theological consequences, that it more or less knocked the idea of design on the head?
I do remember that I understood the principle of Darwinism before I believed it was really big enough to do the job. So I understood the principle of it and realized that, yes, that is a candidate explanation for doing this job, but I still don't think it's a big enough job. And it was only later that I decided, yes, it is a big enough.
Well, in that case, I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to ask you, for the point of view of the viewers, to... It's an awkward question I'm asking you, to give us a summary of the most persuasive version of Darwinian theory.
Right. First, I would make a distinction between the fact of evolution, the actual change from generation to generation that has led from bacterial ancestors to all the creatures that we have today by gradual change, such that you wouldn't have noticed it in any particular generation. That is a matter of fact which can be observed not directly but by its aftermath in the form of fossils and the pattern of living creatures. Then ask, what is the guiding force that led to it being like that? Natural selection. And the most illuminating way I can think of to explain that is that all living things contain digitally coded representations of themselves, digitally coded instructions for building themselves and for making more like themselves. The instructions survive or they don't survive, depending upon how good the bodies are at surviving and how good the bodies are at reproducing and therefore passing them on. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the world becomes filled with coded instructions for being successful in building bodies that survive and reproduce those very same coded instructions.
Now, the objection that is constantly raised by people who hear this, to me and to you, extremely persuasive argument, they say, aha, but what is the source of these fruitful novelties upon which natural selection exerts its pressures? People would say, well, surely the novelties themselves, even if they are then pressure is exerted upon them, something has to explain the novelties themselves.
Yeah. Well, the novelties themselves, of course, are genetic variations in the gene pool, which ultimately come from mutation and more proximally come from sexual recombination. There's nothing very inventive or ingenious about those novelties. I mean, they are random. And they mostly are deleterious. Most mutations are bad. And so you really need to focus on natural selection as the positive side, and it's only natural selection that produces living things which have the illusion of design. The illusion of design does not come from the novelty. It comes from what happens to the novelty as it is filtered through.
But the argument was constantly levelled about the imperceptible changes which might, in fact, as they were developed and recurred, would have culminated in something as useful as a feather. They constantly emphasised the fact, what was it about that early novelty, before it had accumulated to the point where it was recognisably doing an adaptive job, where could natural selection get its purchase upon something which was no more than a pimple?
Yes. Well, it's a fair point, and it's one that I've talked about quite a lot. There cannot have been intermediate stages which were not beneficial. There's no room in natural selection for the sort of foresight argument that says, well, if we got to persist for the next million years and it'll start becoming useful. That doesn't work. There's got to be a selection pressure all the way.
So there isn't a process, as it were, going on in the cell saying, look, be patient.
No.
It's going to be a feather, believe me.
Yes. Sidney Brenner satirized that beautifully when he said he imagined some protein arising in the Cambrian, which was kept because it might come in handy in the Cretaceous. It doesn't happen like that. There's got to be a series of advantages all the way in the feather. If you can't think of one, then that's your problem, not natural selection's problem. Natural selection, well, I suppose that is a sort of matter of faith on my part, since the theory is so coherent and so powerful. You mentioned feathers. I mean, it's perfectly possible that feathers began as sort of fluffy extensions of reptilian scales to act as heat insulators. And so the final perfection of the sort of wing feathers that we see in flying birds might have come very much later, and the earliest feathers might have been a different approach to hairiness among reptiles, keeping them warm. Over and over again, we come across cases where an organ starts out doing one thing and then gets modified to doing another thing. But it's not very useful to challenge an individual biologist's ingenuity in thinking up what particular intermediates might have looked like, because we don't, I mean, maybe we're just not ingenious enough to think what they are. I should have thought there's a more general argument, which is that we shouldn't in any case be saying, oh, I can't think what the explanation for it is, therefore it must have been designed. There's a fatal weakness in any argument which says, I cannot understand how X could have happened, therefore it must have been designed. It would be as if you took a famous scientific discovery, I mean, I think of Hodgkin and Huxley's working out of how the nerve impulse works, a very difficult problem involving very tough mathematics. Suppose that they found it too difficult. Would we have respected them if they'd said something like, I can't work out how this nerve impulse works, Hodgkin, can you? No, Huxley, I can't. Let's just give up and say God did it. It's that element of giving up, it's that element of defeatism, saying I can't understand how it works, therefore let's fall back on the design explanation.
Yes, even if it doesn't take the form of explicit conscious design on the part of a creator, one of the ideas which seems to me to be the counterpart of what you're saying was the invoking of the vital principle in the 19th century.
I mean, vital principles, force locomotive, none of them explain anything. They're just redescriptions of the problem. But they're pernicious because people think they explain something. It sort of vaguely sounds as though it explains something, and people are so used to the idea that complicated things in our human world are indeed designed and made. But when you've said, oh, it was designed by God, you've explained absolutely nothing, because you're left with the problem of explaining where the designer came from. And so it's a non-explanation. We shouldn't even regard it as a candidate explanation.
Why do you think it was that for really very intelligent biologists to invoke something which we can see now, and it's surprising that they couldn't see then, was such a vacuous explanation as the vital principle to account for the spontaneity of living things?
Well, I suppose it's all very well for us to say we can see that it's nonsense, but when you didn't have anything better, I mean, I could imagine in the time of Hume, for example, he would have said, this is a bad explanation, and he was right. But he didn't actually have a better one to put in its place. And so you have to be quite intellectually courageous to stick on the philosophical point that is clearly a bad explanation. And I think that in a real sense it had to wait for Darwin, who produced a deeply satisfying explanation. I mean, it would have been wonderful if Hume would have been simply captivated to have heard Darwin's explanation, I suspect.